Oh no! Oh no, Mrs.
But that's not all. Across the country in London, the professional and personal files of Frankie Howerd's career have also recently come to light. They were stored in his former agent's garden shed for the last 20 years, and now the huge collection of unseen documents and photographs can be viewed for the first time. Amongst the collection are also hours of untransmitted programs, strange projects like Up the Alps, Frankie's misadventures at a ski resort.
What is she doing here?
The reams of letters show Frankie's wide circle of friends, including Laurence Olivier, Alec Guinness and Paul McCartney. Also discovered were in-depth interviews which have never been broadcast. And there's the story of Frankie Howerd's work with the Beatles and a bizarre collaboration with the Bee Gees.
Who are you?
Your son's father.
Oh yes, the leeches.
The unseen files and recordings tell the story of a life of extreme highs and lows, of a man touched by genius but cursed with anxiety and self-doubt. They show how he survived a roller coaster career, getting laughs with an act that broke all the rules and influenced so many others. They show that Frankie Howerd was a man who truly suffered for his art, and his art was comedy.
I was amazed!
And to you all, the best of luck. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Oh, to be incarcerated. I don't want to be incarcerated. Incarcerated. Look it up in the dictionary. Oh, I'm too young to die, too young.
Come on, then.
Wait a minute. I'm finished yet. Hours to go.
Sure.
There's a monologue here. It's my best bit. Oh, I've forgotten where I am.
As a comic, he was just wonderful.
You're looking very well.
Oh, really?
Very well, I must say. I must say that in the script.
It's the charm of it as well, really, you know. It's just so charming to be really just making a selection of noises and no, and everyone just be falling about laughing. You're not actually saying all that much.
Now, this is it. I was wondering how to get these in. Thank you. No, listen.
What he did was always brilliant, and it remained brilliant. You know, like the best comics. He was the one that was being funny, and the stuff he was talking about was really that was just stuff he said while he was being funny. You know?
I come from a military background. Oh, yes. Oh, a lot of heroes in our family. 4 heroes. Oh, yes. No. The first, no, you're mocking Francis.
For me, he was stand-up comedy.
Come on now, get your titters out now, please. Get your titters out. Titter time has arrived. Let's have all the little titters out. That's right. And the big ones, Mrs. Yes. Get your big titters out. Let's have all titters.
When Frankie Howerd was a boy, he found God. He went to church. He said his prayers. He had a vision of himself as St. Francis of Eltham, South London.
I started off with the intention of being a saint. That roughly was some idea of being a saint. And you also may have gathered since then I've been a spectacular failure at that.
Evidence of his lifelong interest in religion can still be seen at his house in Somerset. Resting on a table by the front door is the Howerd family Bible. And for luck, Frankie would place his hand on this Bible each time he left the house. As a young man, he even planned to become a priest, but a trip to the Lewisham Hippodrome changed all that. Frankie Howerd was seduced by the tainted world of show business and began to worship the comedy icons of the variety theatre. Max Miller, Sid Field, George Robey, fallen angels with dirty jokes, and the young Frankie Howerd was hooked. A bawdy kind of comedy was now in his blood, and for the rest of his life, Frankie would be torn between saint and sinner.
Welcome to Variety Bandbox.
In 1946, Frankie Howerd appeared on BBC Radio's Variety Bandbox and became a star.
Frankie Howerd. Now, ladies and gentlemen. Now look, now listen, now look. Now look, no, I'm not the one to complain, am I?
Variety Bandbox not only started his career, but it really made him a huge star in Britain. At one stage, it was really the big radio show, and radio was far more popular than TV, and so if you were at the top of radio, you were at the top of show business.
Eric Sykes wrote a lot for him in those days, and Eric wrote brilliantly for him. And surreal stuff, taking an elephant on the tube, and oh, wonderful.
2 elephants. 2 elephants. I was a So I got a bit of string. And I tied it round their necks, you see, and I let them out into the street. Oh, I didn't feel a ninny. Anyway, but the way people stared, you'd think they'd never seen 2 elephants going down the underground before.
I mean, it must have been extraordinary hearing him on the radio in the 40s, this bizarre torrent of exaggerated burlesque vocals. And when you see his face, it fits entirely, because he's not actually a deadpan. His face is just running around the whole playground, hitting people and running away. His face is just massively elastic.
By the end of his 4 years on Variety Bandbox, Frankie Howerd was one of the most famous comedians in the country, earning huge amounts of money in the process. He had made it to the top and wanted to stay there. He was ambitious and talented, and he wanted it all. He spoke of his ambition in an interview with the BBC's Arena in 1989. The full interview was found in his agent's archives, and unseen extracts from the tapes are being shown on television now for the very first time.
I was very ambitious, very, to succeed. I wanted to be famous. I don't know why, actually. I did. And I don't know the actual goal to be famous. I often puzzle out what the goal of being famous actually is, what it does to be famous.
Frankie Howerd swept to the top with a burst of creative energy that shook up the world of variety.
It's important for people to remember these days that in the time when Frankie Howerd became a star, there was a very conventional view of what a stand-up comedian was, that he was basically a clown. He was a turn, and they wore funny outfits or very smart outfits, and they had a very rigid line of patter. And Frankie Howerd changed that, and that was quite revolutionary at the time.
We didn't have anyone who looked like him. You know, all the comics up before him all came on in smart suits and bloody trilby hats, like Trinder and people like that, and were smart and slick and doing great gags and all this stuff. But Frank was rambling, and like he looked, he was rambling and strange. We didn't know what the hell he was all about. He made me laugh.
Frankie's originality was no accident. He had a vision of a new type of stand-up comedy, as he explains in this previously unseen interview.
I used to come on as though I wasn't with this show at all. I'm not with this lot. Oh no, they're a funny lot. Oh, I keep myself to myself. I think it's best, don't you? You're right.
In the early 50s, Frankie Howerd was riding the crest of a wave, and the next step was the movies. Jumping for Joy was set in the dodgy world of London greyhound racing.
What's it be this time, Sonny?
Cactus Jack.
3 to 1, how much you want on it? Couple of hundred?
Yes. There you are.
He had ambitions to be a Bob Hope-style international comedy star, but the films he was making were never going to deliver international stardom. His brief appearance in the Ealing comedy The Lady Killers would really highlight the gap between comedy star and film star.
Young men!
Do you mind? Now, go on, get out of it. Get this horse out the way there. He's been following me all the way down from Burton Street. He's had 3 pounds of my best pippins, and it's around 6. He's had it again. Now, go on, get out of it. Go on, get out.
The Lady Killers would become a classic thanks to the acting talent of Peter Sellers and Alec Guinness. Frankie Howerd would, for now, have to accept the role as a memorable bit part player. These original drawings for his own comic strip in Film Fun show that by the mid-50s, Frankie Howerd was a major star. It was all going so well. Nobody could have predicted what happened next. The comedian Frankie Howerd lived for many years in this house in Somerset. It still contains many of his personal possessions, including the OBE he was awarded in 1977.
I expected to leave a trail of wreckage in Buckingham Palace. Apart from knocking into 2 footmen, I didn't do too badly. And even this stayed on, which was quite something for me.
By his side to collect his OBE at Buckingham Palace was his long-term partner, Dennis Hamer. They lived together in this house called Wavering Down, and it was Dennis who kept everything as it was in the years following Frankie's death.
I went to Wavering Down and I knew Dennis, who was Frankie's long-term partner. It slightly turned into a bit of a museum, you know, sort of Howard's End, really, with, you know, his, a wig of his had been preserved and posters of his films, so it's quite a sweet memorial to him in a slightly odd way.
Occasionally, Dennis would host open days at the house where visitors could view strange items such as Frankie's false teeth and an X-ray of his pelvis.
Well, I went to Frankie's house in the West Country to do a report for The Guardian, and it was an extraordinary place. Dennis was still alive at that time, and there were literally papers on his table. His briefcase was there. Also, loads of Egyptian stuff. You know, they got all sorts of stuff from going to Egypt. And the extraordinary thing was that when I went there, he'd been dead, 15 years at least, and it seemed like he'd left the place about 15 minutes before.
Frankie's partner, Dennis Hamer, had such a deep interest in ancient Egypt that he bought himself a coffin in the style of a pharaoh. He kept it in the lounge for years and was buried in the sarcophagus when he died in 2009.
You dream boats, you lovable dream boats.
Dennis and Frankie had met in 1955, when homosexuality was still a criminal offence.
I had friends like Frank and Jimmy Edwards, and there was Ross Conway, the pianist, and they were gay, and if they didn't come out, there was no hypocrisy involved. If they'd come out or been outed, they would have been ruined and go to prison. I mean, it was just a hideous era. They were haunted, hunted men.
Oh, yes. He said, you see, he said, the trouble with you is, he said, you're so difficult to categorize. He said, you see, you don't fit in anywhere. You're neither one thing nor the other. I don't know what he meant by that. He said, there's too much tittering, naughty tittermongers here.
When Frankie met Dennis, his career was at a crisis point. A combination of insecurity and perfectionism had made him very difficult to work with. A letter to Frankie from the BBC at this time asks for no more fusses, no more arguments.
Behind the scenes, he was a great worrier and always pushing everyone around him to do the best they could. And it meant that he would inevitably have lots and lots of arguments with producers and engineers and just about anyone working on his shows. He drove many producers to the point of collapse, and one, in fact, to a full-blown nervous breakdown.
The patience of the BBC was further tested by a disastrous appearance on the panel show What's My Line in 1954. The unscripted programme relied on quick-fire repartee, but Frankie, paralysed by fear, said almost nothing.
Because I had a note the other day from this, what's his name, you know, the man in charge, what's his name, you know, thing, you know. Well, no, I had this note and it said, Dear Howard, your presence is requested in my office between 2:30 and 2:35. I thought to myself, hello. He's never given me that long before. They must be worried. So I went in there, and he said, you know, thing, and he said, yes. He said, there you are. And he looked at his secretary, and she said, Howard. He said, yes. Come in, Trevor. He said, now, he said, do sit down. Well, he's never offered me a seat before, so I knew it was all right. He said, would you care for a cigarette? I said, thank you very much. So he threw his tin over. And he said, I wonder if you roll me one as well while you're at it.
He had been the golden boy of BBC comedy, but by the end of the 50s, his reputation was in tatters, as Galton and Simpson, the writers of Hancock's Half Hour, found out.
When we finished working with Tony Hancock, the BBC in the persona of Tom Sloan, Head of Light Entertainment, called us up to the BBC and said, well, now you're not working with Tony anymore, what do you want to do?
And so he said, oh, we would like to write the series of Frankie Howerd. He said, are you kidding? He said, he's finished. And we said, what do you mean finished? He said, his last series was terrible.
I don't know, Frank began to lose favour with everybody. You know, one minute he was a huge star, and then gradually, over a period, he wasn't. You know, it was really awful to watch, to be honest.
I beg your pardon. Who are you? Who am I? I'm Frankie Howerd.
Who?
Well, if your own agent's never heard of you, what chance do you stand?
As the offers of work dried up, Frankie would begin to suffer periods of intense depression.
Well, of course it affected him greatly. He loved his audience, you know, and if he was being rejected or wasn't being allowed to practice his craft and that, he would get very depressed. Everyone would, you know. People say to me, when are you going to retire? And I say, when they stop asking. Well, they stopped asking, Frank. And he didn't, that's terribly upsetting, you know. Particularly at the age he wasn't an old man when he got the elbow, really, you know.
It's rather moving thinking back, him sort of brooding at home and nothing's happening. Oh, it's over, you know, it's over. And it never was, happily, but he wouldn't know that at the time.
With his career on the slide, there was another shock when Frankie discovered he had lost all his money in dubious investments made by his agent, Stanley Scruffy Dale. By 1960, Frankie Howerd, the most innovative comedian of his generation, had no money and no career.
He'd had career knocks, he'd had financial disasters, then his mother died, and he was crushed as an individual to a great extent, to the point where he even sought therapy with LSD that was being experimented on at the time. And he used to go for fortnightly weekends where he would be injected with LSD and Ritalin, and then be psychoanalyzed because he just couldn't figure out how to get out of this trough that he'd found himself in.
In this unseen interview, he looks back on those difficult times.
I never actually gave up show business. I mean, I never stopped working, as we say, but it dwindled, let's put it that way, down to a very trickle in the desert.
For a man who had once been at the top of the entertainment world, the trickle of work was not enough. It broke his heart, but he decided the next job would be his last. At Frankie's house in Somerset, a bronze figure on a side table tells the story of that next job and the impact it had on the rest of his career. It's an award given to Frankie for his years of entertaining speeches at the Evening Standard Drama Awards, including the one he was about to make. Frankie had accepted that it was all over for him. He had made up his mind to do one last performance, and this was it. But if this was the end, he wanted it to be Frankie Howerd at his best.
I want to make a little appeal to you, but it's not an appeal for money. You're all right, love, to getting the purse out. You're all right, love. No, it's an appeal for you to try and laugh as much as you can at the jokes.
I mean, they'd never had a compare for the awards like him. Always bitching and gossiping about who, you know, he turned it into a show. It was wonderful.
And at that Evening Standard was Peter Cook. And he and Dudley Moore, they got this club they've opened called The Establishment.
Peter Cook had opened the Establishment Club the year before as the new home of cutting-edge comedy. On the spot, he offered Frankie Howerd a month-long run at the club. He later told the story of their meeting on This Is Your Life in 1976.
At the drama awards, which were quite serious, he just sent the whole thing up so marvellously, seemingly ad lib. And I thought the establishment needed sending up because we were a pretty snotty little club at that time. And I thought we needed somebody to send it up. But I was very scared, you see, to ask you. Because you're a big star, you see.
Really?
So I had to have a couple of scotches before I'd come up and say hello. Then I read in your book you were sloshed at the time.
I was, yeah. I was scared of
Half a bottle of scotch, I'd say. Anyway, I won't waste any more time. I'd say one of the funniest men in the world. I'd say the funniest, but Dudley's very sensitive.
At the very moment he had given up hope, Peter Cook had thrown him a lifeline.
Peter Cook was very much a pure comedian. He was really into the idea of comedy rather than just advancing his career. I think he loved comedy in its purest form, and I think with Frankie Howerd, he just saw someone who transcended his surroundings. He didn't obviously care about Frankie Howerd being a leftover from the 50s or anything like that. He just really liked Frankie Howerd and thought that Frankie Howerd's humour rightly or wrongly, would work in this new context of the establishment and the world of beyond the fringe.
With its reputation for radical satire, the establishment club didn't seem to be the natural home for Frankie Howerd, and he was convinced it was going to be a disaster.
He was very nervous leading up to it, you know. I mean, because it was a complete change for him.
Part of him thought, I wonder if I'm going to be any good at this, you know.
A tense and nervous Frankie heard Peter Cook make the introduction.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, Frankie Howerd.
Frankie Howerd then walked on stage with his entire career on the line. The Establishment Club 63, and on stage, a nervous Frankie Howerd.
I'd like to explain how I happened to get here in this place before we start, because as you know, if you do know at all, I'm a humble music hall comedian, a sort of variety artist. You know, I'm not usually associated with these sophisticated venues.
Although Frankie could be nervous before the show, when it started, he was on, and he was the Frankie Howerd.
Out of all of the apparent nervousness and fragile quality that he had, when it came to his act, he was very brave when he thought what he was doing was right. And that was the art, and he was going to protect it and defend it no matter what.
Every year they have these drama awards, the Evening Standard Drama Awards at the Savoy, the hotel. Well, there are so many cafes of that name now. This is the hotel. And it's, they have a dinner there. This young lad came over to me, and quite a presentable boy, quite a nice lad, quite a nice type, you know. And he said, I was wondering if I could introduce myself. He said, I'm Cook. So I said, oh, it was a lovely meal. I said, well, you loved it. Really did.
It was a night that changed Frankie's life. The fashionable crowd loved him. It was a triumph and a resurrection at the home of the new wave of comedy.
Delighted for Frank, because he was going through a bad period where people were assuming that he was finished. And it's very difficult. Once people start thinking that and believing it, it's very difficult to get out of it, you know. But he did it. With one bound, he was free, as they.
I must say I did enjoy it very much. I did it twice nightly. So it was rather odd to do a nightclub twice nightly. But it did very well. When I was there, playing there, we had a visit from a distinguished gentleman called, well, he thought he was distinguished, called Ned Sherrin. Who shall remain anonymous. And he engaged me to appear in That Was the Week That Was. So that was my satirical stage I went through then.
Ned Sherrin was the producer of That Was the Week That Was.
That was the week that was. It's over, let it go.
The show defined the satirical comedy attitude of the day. Into this new radical arena came the 46-year-old Frankie Howerd.
And now the week at Westminster, and our lobby correspondent is Mr. Frankie Howerd.
Before we, this is the, I'm on, oh, this is the one I'm on, yes. It's about time. I've been wasting a hell of a time here to get on. It's 25 to 12. I thought I'd have to have another shave before I got on, but never mind. So I enjoyed bits of it. And I mean the bits I understood. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought, no,
Now he's suddenly found himself at the satirical centre of show business. And he took the mickey out of it, basically, that's what he did.
Of course, the longer he went on, the more his confidence grew. He thought, I'm back, here we go again, I'm back on television. And it's working, you know, and he began to really enjoy it.
I saw the producer, this Ned Sherrin, and no, nice man underneath, and he, no, and listen, no, please.
For one night only, the show that loved to attack politicians gave the floor to a comedian who turned the whole concept on its head.
My technique was to play right against a current trend of attacking them. I used to defend them, which is my defence was a jolly sight worse actually than anybody else's attack, because I would never say a joke about Macmillan to direct. I used to say, I should talk about his wife, Dorothy, you see. I'd say, no, it's not him. No, it's her. More. Everyone blames Mac. Everyone, you know this is true. Everyone blames Macmillan for sacking half the government last year. You see, everyone blames Macmillan for sacking half the government, but you see, I don't. No, I'm sorry, I don't. I don't blame him. I blame her. No, I do. It's Dot.
It was over the garden wall again. He said, oh, I blame Dot. She was suddenly Dot. Lady Dorothy Macmillan. That was brilliant. That was pure Howard. I blame Dot. Gossip.
There's a moment where you see the joy in his face where he realises that they're not taking the mickey out of him, that he's not a novelty act, that they haven't just put somebody they remember as a kid on to be laughed at. He's being laughed with. The audience are getting back into it, and it may have seemed old-fashioned to them, but in the midst of that kind of old-fashioned delivery, he was actually delivering some really interesting satirical stuff.
It was massive on a Saturday night. Pubs and restaurants would empty, people going home to watch. That was the week that was. He couldn't have had a better showcase for a comeback, for, you know, to appear on that big show on a Saturday night. It was great.
It was a career-defining performance. He had entered the world of the sharp minds of Oxbridge satire and given a masterclass in the art of stand-up comedy. Frankie Howerd was now one of the hottest properties in show business, from the bottom of the heap to the top in just a few eventful months. He was being feted and admired, but Frankie Howerd's finances were still in a sorry state. But all that was about to change. From across the Atlantic, from the heart of New York City, a Stephen Sondheim musical would greatly improve the Frankie Howerd bank balance. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. The biggest hit show on Broadway came to London's West End, and Frankie got the starring role. The play also started a running theme in Frankie's act. For the first time, he was being saucy with semi-naked women.
Go ahead and look her over as you did before, but then when you get around, put your arm up like this, Christine, and you look through it.
This rare film shows Frankie rehearsing with the show's legendary Broadway director, George Abbott.
That's it. I've got a feeler, haven't I, first? That's it. I must keep this in, because I enjoyed this bit. Ah, you've got one as well.
For a man who was trying to be discreet about his sexuality, the lecherous character of Pseudolus was the perfect part. And bawdy sexual innuendo became a major part of his act from this point on. 2 years of A Funny Thing Happened on the way to the Forum also sparked an interest in all things Roman. At the house in Somerset, the garden is dotted with versions of classical statues, and Frankie had Roman columns installed in the lounge. In one corner, his 3D Elvis Presley portrait hangs incongruously next to one of the columns. The pride of Frankie's Roman collection were 2 replica swords, which still sit by the fireplace. They were given to him by his friend Richard Burton, and were the swords Burton used when he played Mark Antony in the 1963 film Cleopatra. Frankie Howerd knew exactly what the Romans had done for him, on stage and soon on television. A Radio Times from December 1964 shows that Frankie Howerd was back on television. The Frankie Howerd Show was written by the best in the business, Galton and Simpson, the writers of Hancock's Half Hour and Steptoe and Son. In this episode, Frankie has had enough of living on his own.
I've never felt so bad. Do you know, for 1 minute, I was seriously considering the gas oven. No, it was no good, because it was only one of those tiny bachelor ones. It's a hard enough job getting your foot in. And I said to myself, Francis, this is not the answer, not the coward's way out. Pull yourself together, you blithering fool. As I often talk to myself like that, you know. Don't care what I say to myself, no. I give myself a right lashing sometimes. I said, Francis, you are still young. Now get out into the world and find yourself a mate.
Frankie signs up with a Lonely Hearts Agency and is sent on a series of disastrous blind dates. This one with June Whitfield.
Excuse me, I don't suppose for one moment you are, but could you by any chance be a Miss Beryl Cuttlebun?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes. Pardon?
I am Beryl Cuttlebun.
Must be something wrong with her. Would you permit me to introduce myself? I am Francis A. Howerd, Esquire.
Oh, don't touch me. I can't stand men touching me.
Didn't I tell you now? I always get them, don't I?
Everyone enjoyed the sketches with Frankie and June. Everyone, that is, except Frankie.
He didn't really like performing. He hated it. And, he always said if he could win the lottery or something, he wouldn't do it. He was so nervous before he did a show.
The nervousness works to his advantage in the end, as he worried away at every aspect of his performance. And it was in this series that Frankie experimented with the device of breaking off from the story to talk directly to the camera.
You must think I'm rather strange.
Oh no, not at all. What a funny woman.
It was quite something for a television to take the viewer, basically, the viewers aside from the action and say, listen, it was a great technique and so perfectly suited to Frankie Howerd.
I just totally lap up that whole thing of he's talking to the audience and it's all, I've got to know. I love the way he's bouncing off audience reactions. So it's just so spontaneous,
Nobody done it, and he was probably one of the few people who could do it properly and get away with it. you know. Just that gap between the television and the audience at home, drawing them in. Lovely.
I should turn the sound off if I were you. She's not on long. I should turn the vision off as well.
Might be long.
Ah, yes, thank you.
By the mid-60s, television fame was the only thing that counted in the world of entertainment, and Frankie Howerd was one of TV's biggest stars. His shambolic style was even put to use in advertising, and he became the unlikely face of Lion's Made ice cream.
I'm doing this commercial for ice cream. Fools, I never touch the stuff. No, still they're paying me. Ah, yes. Here. Strawberry and vanilla ice cream rippled with a strawberry sauce or with a cherry on top. Extravagant devils.
Audiences everywhere had a great affection for Frankie, and he was also admired and adored by his fellow comedians. As a guest star, he was the highlight of any programme, and he was a regular on the Bruce Forsyth Show.
He was wonderful to work with. I just loved the man.
Pretend you're sawing a piece of wood with one hand.
Oh, yes.
Yes, that's right. And blowing up a balloon with the other.
Oh.
That's it. No, you'll never make a trombone player. Let me see. Pretend? I'm waiting to continue the show.
Oh,
Pretend.
sorry. Pretend or pretend?
Pretend? I'll start again. Pretend? Where the hell are we now?
A lot of the time, Frankie could forget his lines, and that's why you say, oh, well, yes, oh, well, no, oh, no, well, I make myself come. All that used to cover up him sometimes trying to think of his lines.
That was to be a G, dear. Give me G, love. Give me G. What?
Now, it doesn't matter. You got the gist of it, didn't you?
Yeah, I got the gist of it all right, yeah.
Not the words, it's the acting that's important. Now, Chris.
All right, well, we've only just met.
Now, you all... Listen.
Frankie often went into a whole other level of apparent amateurishness when teamed with other performers. He had a long-running routine with various female piano players who were hard of hearing and got everything wrong.
It was fashionable in those days for people who sang to have a accompanist, have a pianist. An awful lot of people sang, stars, and always had their own pianist. And they would perhaps be in evening dress and have a pianist at the piano. And they were always men. I never ever saw a woman pianist. And so I thought, well, if it is, I'll get a woman. If it has got a straight man pianist, I'll have a comedy lady pianist. Just a bit different.
I'm going to do a song tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to sing a song which, oh God, don't laugh, you don't. No, don't, you'll get me into trouble, please, no, don't. No, she's a funny woman. She knows she can't hear very well, she has this impediment of the ear, and she's a bit miserable, you know. Only some people are happy sufferers, but she's, you know, she's bitter with it, you know. Isn't it? No, don't laugh. It might be one of your own. Don't laugh. Poor soul. Now, yes, it is. It's chilly tonight, yes. Poor old soul, she's past it.
She would say chilly. Ooh, chilly, chilly. And he'd go, oh, yes, chilli, chilli. I'm sweating like a pig. And, you know, talking about the pianist over there.
Well, now listen. We'll do a song now, do a song. Do a song now! Do a song now, yes. Oh, she's a burden, I can't. Now this is a kind of aria. A kind of aria. Do the aria now! Yes, the aria! She doesn't know whether she's on her aria or her elbow.
I love the way that the sort of grand piano, the slightly dour-looking female pianist, and him making remarks to the audience about her, clearly, you know, in the real world, within earshot, but supposedly out of earshot of the pianist. It's all about, you know, I'm telling you something about this person, and they can't hear me, which is sort of what his whole act was kind of about anyway. Listen, these people, let me tell you this, you know.
It was a comic idea he came up with during the war, but it still worked on stage 45 years later.
Hers is a sad story. No, don't laugh. Hers is a sad story. Yours, I'm just saying, yours is a sad story. And because 5 years ago, tragedy struck. Tragedy struck 5 years ago.
The 1960s saw Frankie Howerd fast becoming a British comedy icon, and a clue to just how big he had become can be found in his files. This invitation from Paul McCartney is evidence of a close relationship with the Beatles. Frankie even interviewed McCartney on television, but all that survives is this short sound recording.
Mr. Paul McCartney, here he is. How did you manage to get this youthful image? That's what I want to know.
Well, you know, I do a lot of exercise.
What sort of
well, you know, every
anything
morning.
you can tell us about?
Well, you know, every morning, twice round the block.
Yeah, you try on the block,
yeah.
I see.
Frankie had known the Beatles from their earliest days, so when the Beatles needed help in 1965, they turned to Frankie Howerd. These rare photographs tell the story of Frankie's forgotten work on the Beatles film Help.
I'm fairly sure the Beatles wanted him in Help because he'd been a good supporter of them in their early days. He actually managed to get them gigs when they were underage in places like Jersey. And he was quite a good advisor in those days. He used to meet them informally. And so they were big fans, particularly Lennon and McCartney, I think.
Yeah, that says a lot about Frankie's success at the time, that he would be in a film with the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles presumably could choose pretty much who they asked to be in their films, and maybe they thought he was funny.
Because when the Beatles made their films, they put in people like Ivor Cutler. They put in cult comedians. They didn't put in Jimmy Tarbuck, although I'm sure he'd love to have been in it. They put in people like Frankie Howerd. Even though Frankie Howerd was popular, he was a cult figure. The Beatles just liked comedy. They were very good at appreciating comedy.
And he was in a scene with Paul McCartney and Wendy Richard, and they filmed it. It was all made, but when they got to cut the movie, Dick Lester cut the whole section out.
I think he was quite shattered when he found that he was on the cutting room floor because he enjoyed doing it, and I think he thought it worked quite well.
Frankie Howerd was now right at the centre of 60s show business, and the disappointment of Help was soon replaced by the excitement of Carry On Doctor. Frankie made two films in quick succession, Carry On Doctor and Carry On Up the Jungle, and in both films he was the highest paid actor.
Quick, show him your doings. I beg your pardon? Show him your doings. I will not. You show him yours. He wants to see a bit of magic. Well, you should have said you'll see magic. Oh, show me magic doing. It's magic doings. Oh, dear, he's insistent, isn't he? Well, now, have you... No, you are... Now, wait a minute. This, was... oh, look, 12 o'clock. That's it. You've got him going.
In his second film, Carry On Up the Jungle, Frankie found a friend in Joan Sims. This rare behind-the-scenes footage offers a glimpse into what Frankie described as their mad chemistry.
Ah, Lady Berkeley, did you see the giraffes just now?
Yes, I did. Quaint things. I wonder why it is they need such long necks.
Ah, well, it's quite simple, really. It's because their heads are so far away from their bodies.
But what I wanted to know was, if one came in close contact with a snake,
Yes.
could it harm one?
Well, that would depend on the snake. And there is, and there is a brown one, of course.
Go on, Frank.
Oh, sorry. There is a brown one, of course. The African viper, which is quite deadly.
Oh, no. This was definitely a green one. And it seemed to move sort of like that.
Ah, that would be a windscreen viper there.
Frankie Howerd now left behind the carry-ons in hospital and up the jungle for eruptions of laughter in Up Pompeii. As the 60s drew to a close, Frankie Howerd could reflect on the achievement of coming back from the brink of obscurity to the top of his profession. He had made all kinds of films and starred in West End theatre productions. But one thing still eluded him, a successful situation comedy. But lurking around the corner was the spark of an idea.
The head of light entertainment at the BBC in those days was on holiday and was looking around the ruins of Pompeii and said he half expected, thinking of a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, to see Frankie Howerd come around the corner in a toga. And that suddenly sparked the idea into life of saying, why don't we do a sitcom?
Oh, some shocking things go on here, you know. Shocking. Licentiousness, libertinage, orgies, even bingo.
A pilot episode of Up Pompeii was made in September 1969, and the first series soon followed.
They did Frankie the world of good. It was a marvellous show, and he was great in it. Built for him.
Up Pompeii was the perfect vehicle for Frankie Howerd's comedy. It thrived on innuendo and gossip, and was set in a world of intrigue, treachery, and sex.
It was quite sort of naughty telly that I shouldn't really be watching, because there were lots of sort of nubile girls wandering around who were jolly pretty.
It's putting me off. Don't you turn that No bra or anything.
It was very sexual, but mostly it was just about how ludicrous the situation was. That his whole thing, like any great comedian, is like, isn't everything stupid? Isn't everything ridiculous? You're ridiculous, I'm ridiculous, life is pointless. And the whole thing with that character was just, aren't these people ludicrous? Aren't they silly?
Remember the 3 wise monkeys and keep your counsel?
Yes, and you remember the 3 brass monkeys and keep out of a draft.
It was set in 79 AD, but it was really the middle-aged comedian's take on the swinging 60s. Frankie began each episode in stand-up comedy mode, but this time it was called the prologue.
Greetings, good citizens. The prologue. Oh, dear. Cold as ever. Now.
It was always the prologue, wasn't it? The prologue. It was like, right, we're presenting a genuine historical epic here. And the fact that you had the prologue, and then somebody comes in, and there's the soothsayer, and there's someone else, and he's like, oh, right.
This god, Zeus, looked down on Earth and he saw this maiden, Leda, and he fancied her, see? So he said, right. He said, I will go down to Earth. Are you expecting anybody?
You know, it's the same thing he did with his stand-up, where you would go, you know, I'm presenting, oh, hang on, right, and then off he goes, you know.
Frankie Howerd used every trick of his comedy trade to make the show work. But there was one trick which really stood out. His favourite technique of talking straight to the camera, to the audience, to us.
I don't want to die.
You don't want to die?
I'm too young to die.
Too young to die.
We shall overcome.
We will overcome.
We shan't go to war.
We won't go to war.
Down with war.
Down with war.
Down with war.
Down with war. What a shocking actor, isn't he?
It's Roman times, and he's talking to a camera. And sending up all the other characters. Made for him.
I love the fact that everyone is no one is allowed to kind of look out except Frankie. So the whole thing is this like kind of play going on around him, and he's like this the whole time down the lens. You know?
Fire and brimstone will rain down on the city. The very ground will tremble, and all shall perish in the destruction.
And that is the end of the weather forecast. Silly old bag.
Up Pompeii was all about drawing attention to the camera, the audience, the script, the poverty of the script, the terrible acting involved, and he'd be constantly stepping out and being Frankie Howerd, and that made it very funny, very unusual, and very radical in a way.
Frankie Howerd had finally made a classic situation comedy, but not all his fans approved of Up Pompeii. Discovered in the Howerd files are some of the huge amount of letters he received from unhappy viewers.
I got a tremendous amount of letters, and there were 9 of the 10 out of every 10 liked it very much, and the 10th thought it was the most dreadful thing they've ever seen on television.
Dear Mr. Howerd, these episodes are merely disgusting, not even funny. Dirt for dirt's sake gets terribly tedious. Neither my wife nor I would dream of missing one of your programs until the present series of Up Pompeii and the filth that passes for humour. You don't have to rely on filth, Mr. Howerd. You really don't. We loved you as you were. The sensitive Frankie Howerd was hurt by the criticism and took time to reply to all the letters, usually adding at the end, I'm sorry you did not like all the material in the Up Pompeii series, but it is difficult to please everybody all the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Frankie Howerd.
The corny jokes and sexual references may have lost him a few fans, but the series won him the Variety Club's top award for Show Business Personality of the Year for 1971. It had been a long and emotional journey, but Frankie Howerd was finally back at the top.
Well, before I came on here tonight, Mr. Delfont said to me, try not, he said, to look smug as though you've actually deserved it. And I said, well, look, I'll try not to look smug. I said, if you try not to look as though you've actually paid for the awards yourself. I've been in show business this month 25 years, and I started in the music halls, and I started on Variety Bandbox, and it was 25 years ago. I was thinking tonight, my goodness, it's a long time ago, I've had During that time, of course, I've had, like all of you, ups and downs. I've had some success, and I've had a good deal of failure. But I'm thankful, I must tell you this, to be even considered for an award such as this, let alone to actually receive it. And I want to tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, especially, may I say, thank you to those friends of mine in the public who have given me over all these years their support. You know, their support and their laughs, their smiles, and dare I say it, their affection. And I'm very grateful.
Off-screen, there were some unlikely business developments, with Frankie's agent, Beryl Virtue, merging their company with the management of the Bee Gees. This gave rise to one of the strangest projects of Frankie's career. Still in the attic of Frankie's former home, Wavering Down, is Frankie's record collection, and amongst the albums is Cucumber Castle by the Bee Gees. The hour-long film made to promote the album teamed Frankie Howerd with the Bee Gees in a psychedelic medieval tale of kings and cucumbers. It was a lavish but ill-conceived project and, not surprisingly, has not been shown on television since it was first made.
It should be goodbye, really. Where are you going, Bob? I'm dying, aren't I, you fool? Nobody cares. Oh, I haven't finished yet. My God. I've changed my mind. I'm coming back. I think those pills are working.
Soon after Cucumber Castle, Frankie released a strange record of his own.
What?
I was phoned up one day by my agent, said, "Do you want to make a record with Frankie Howerd?" I said, "Yes, of course." So I go along to the studio, and there Frank and Ray and Alan, and they said, "Do you know Je t'aime?" I said, "No." "Oh, well, we'll play it to you." So they played it, you see, a couple of times, and I said, "I see, and I'm the heavy breathing." They said, "That's right."
Up Je t'aime was his version of the French record Je t'aime, the song which appeared to include a recording of the singer Serge Gainsbourg having sex with his girlfriend Jane Birkin. The British version had Frankie Howerd in bed with June Whitfield.
And I was just going, this and the other, you know.
And it turned out in the end that they were in bed with her husband. I remember that because I played the husband.
Oi!
What?
If you two don't keep quiet, I'm getting out of this bed and I'm going to sleep in the other room.
Oh, I'm sorry, Arthur.
But that was your time, which got banned by the BBC for lewdness. I mean, how ridiculous can you be?
Frankie Howerd now embarked on a series of feature films, beginning with a film version of Up Pompeii.
Hey, you there, Slade! Who, me? Yes, you. Move your ass.
Well, that's nice, isn't it?
The next film was Up the Chastity Belt and then Up the Front. The series of Up films were in danger of typecasting Frankie Howerd as a comedian who could only do sexual innuendo. A return to the BBC for An Evening with Francis Howerd was an attempt to change this perception.
This show isn't going to be like all the shows I've been doing recently. I mean, there's no there's no sort of, wait a minute, it's no sort of curvaceous, lovely ladies. And mind you, I hope we get as many titties in this show. But the thing is, no, see, I think it's time to prove that I can rise above all that. Above all that. No, because in real life, I mean, I look down on that sort of thing. Frequently, you fools, you fool.
However much he wanted to change, Frankie Howerd was trapped by his own successful formula. And just when he thought he was out, it would always pull him back in. The worries about failure kept Frankie to tried and tested formulas, and he now rehashed the Up Pompeii template in Whoops Baghdad.
Let them wait till later, let them wait. Greetings, Salam. Welcome to Old Baghdad, gateway to the east, pearl of the Orient, and the best knocking shop this side of Cairo. You're saying to yourselves, he's slipped one in already? That's what you're saying? Yes, he has. I'll tell you why. Because I don't want you to switch off, that's why.
In 1975, as offers in the UK dried up, he set off for Canada to make The Frankie Howerd Show. The 14 episodes, with their colourful titles, have never been shown on UK television. Frankie plays a lodger in a shared house full of misfits.
Honestly, I'm exhausted. Exhausted! Yes. What? Don't laugh. It's wicked to mock the afflicted. Oh. I think what I'll do, listen now, please. Don't be wicked. What I think let's out your faces a minute now. Listen, what I think I'll do, I think I'll have a tinkle. On the pianoforte.
Frankie now had a new agent. Beryl Virtue handed the management of Frankie's career to Tessa Labars, who talks about life with Frankie here for the first time on television.
Just after I took over in 76, I had to go over to see him in Canada. I think he found it a little bit difficult over there. I think he was very pleased to see me. Obviously, Dennis was there with him all the time. Dennis was an extremely calm sort of person who could put up with Frank's occasional highs and lows of anxiety. Dennis is the person who got him through every day. From getting him to the right place at the right time, to checking out the lighting, making sure everything went smoothly. He was absolutely ideal for Frank. And I suppose he and I, between us, really kept him going throughout those years that we were working together with him.
Oh, God, I'm going to faint. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm going to faint. Do you mind, dear? They can't see the face.
Back in Britain, offers of television work remained limited. This Is Your Life told the story of his career so far, and everyone who had played a part was there.
Peter Cook. Eric Sykes.
It was a night of high emotion, and there through it all was his discreet and loyal partner, Dennis Hamer.
Coming along to share it with you.
No, let me just say this, Eamon, you know, it's nice to have these tributes, and I'm very touched, I really am, but... Let me see. When I wasn't doing so well, so many people were kind to me, Dennis and Tessa and Blanche, and they all stood by me, very grateful to me. I'm sorry, I'm really stupid.
The late 70s and early 80s saw another dip in Frankie Howerd's career. From 1983, a variety of TV and theatre productions kept him busy, but nothing captured that special Frankie Howerd quality. A revival of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum failed to live up to former glories. The net was cast wide for interesting projects, and in 1985, Frankie Howerd found himself up the Alps. Up the Alps has never been shown on television before. It shows that Frankie still had a spirit of adventure, and he was not going to give up on his career.
What is she doing here?
As television gave up on him, Frankie Howerd went back on the road, touring theatres with his vintage stand-up comedy act.
It was very funny, you know. Yeah, dear. I didn't know I'd be here. About 6 weeks ago, I was sitting at home one night, watching the telly. Nothing on, mind you, but you get used to that position, you know. And the phone rang. The phone rang, I thought, now, who can this be? Can't be my agent, because he thinks I'm dead.
There were old jokes and new jokes, but one element remained the same. The unique style of Frankie Howerd. The ordinary suit. The shambolic delivery. The connection to the audience.
Well, no. You see, I thought the management would send me a car, see? No, they send me a map.
He toured relentlessly, up and down the country. He'd built a reputation, and they came, in their thousands, to see the man himself, Frankie Howerd. Suddenly and unexpectedly, his time had come again. The alternative comedy of the late 80s was all about stand-up, and a new, younger audience now had an appreciation of the comedy skills of a true original.
No, what? No, don't, you wicked. No, listen. No, listen. Naughty! Now listen. I must ask you to shut your gob.
Frankie Howerd began to sell out bigger and bigger theatres, and the fans kept getting younger and younger.
He came back because of his talent. He was rediscovered again and again. He put the work in, and he just kept coming back. And that strikes me, for all that people talk about his depression and his anxiety, that's an immense resilience there, and also an indication that he wanted to keep going back on stage.
All of a sudden he became a cult figure again, and then it was all up again, so it was wonderful.
Now in his 70s, Frankie Howerd was as popular and admired as he had ever been. He was a prized guest on youth TV shows like The Word. And all the best chat shows now wanted a piece of Frankie. There was also a return to advertising as the face of Boddington's Bitter.
Bitter you not, bitter ye not. Bodies.
If you don't get bodies, you'll just get
bitter.
This late success was everything he could have hoped for, but the high point would come at the most unlikely of venues. Oxford University, and the debating chamber of the Oxford Union was the chosen place for the swan song of Frankie Howerd.
He came on, the place went mad. This was a young audience. But the reception he got from the students was wonderful.
No, before we start the actual comedy acting, what you've come to see, the sort of comedy stuff, I just wanted to say a word to you, which is, well, not serious exactly, but sincere. Yeah. So, it's because, you see, I'm not, well, you know, no, you don't know, but I mean, no, but you'll believe me when I tell you I'm not what you call an intellectual. I'm not I'm not what you call brainy, a sort of clever clogs. I'm not levels, O levels and A levels. Oh, no, not that. Because you're all students. So naturally, to you, I'm not what you call an academic. By no way at all could you call me an intellectual. And which is why I feel so much at home here tonight.
There were echoes of That Was the Week That Was. The old school comedian teaching an Oxbridge crowd a thing or two about the toughest subject of them all, stand-up comedy.
Shut your face. Is mocking. Oh no, Mrs. He's mocking Francis. You're mocking Francis. This is your Francis. Yes, my maiden name, Francis.
Frankie Howerd had nothing left to prove. He was loved, admired and respected right to the end. In April 1992, he was admitted to hospital with heart trouble.
Frankie Howerd was admitted as an emergency to the intensive care unit here at the Harley Street Clinic with a very serious heart problem. This is being treated currently with medication.
He came home